The emergency call came through on the wrong frequency. Nils Cade heard it on the freight handler band while he was loading soil remediation kits onto a supply shuttle at Korath Station. A panicked voice, too high and too fast, spilling galactic common, with the kind of accent that only came from colony worlds where people spent more time talking to livestock than to people. Something about losses. Something about teeth marks the width of a man's hand. Something about a predator no one had ever seen before. He should have kept loading the shuttle. The call wasn't for him. It was for the Colonial Wildlife Authority, or the Drethani military garrison 40 clicks south, or anyone with a sidearm and a badge, and the institutional backing to tell a colony full of terrified ranchers that the situation was under control. Instead, he set down the soil kit, walked to the comm panel, and keyed into the channel. "This is Nils Cade, Terran Wildlife Management. Where's the colony?" Silence. Then the voice, steadier now, anchored by the unexpected answer, came back. "Corvusy Settlement, Tathran's Belt, Rimward Side." "How many head have you lost?" 14 grazers in 9 days. The last 3 were killed inside the barn with the door locked. Whatever's doing this got through a composite wall rated for Class 5 fauna. We asked the garrison. They said it's probably a pack of ridge runners, and to electrify the fences. "Is it ridge runners?" Another pause. "Ridge runners leave bones, Mr. Cade. This thing eats clean, and it only comes at night." 3 hours later, he was on a chartered shuttle dropping through atmosphere toward a colony he'd never heard of, on a world he'd visited exactly once, carrying nothing but his field pack, a handheld scanner, and 20 years of experience reading the ground where predators walked. Corvusy Settlement sat in a broad alluvial valley on the rimward side of Tathran III, a world the Drethani Expansion Authority had classified as agrarian viable 6 decades ago, meaning the soil was rich, the water table was shallow, and nothing in the initial fauna survey had been rated above Class 4. Moderate danger. Standard fencing. No heavy arms required. The colony had grown to 11 families, 43 souls, mostly Drethani with a handful of humans and 1 Tessavari engineer who maintained the atmospheric processors. They raised broadbacks, a domesticated grazer species the size of Terran cattle, thick-hided and slow, bred for the methane-scrubbed pastures of fringe worlds. The broadbacks were their livelihood, their trade currency, their reason for being on a planet 3 relay jumps from anything that mattered. And something was killing them. The settlement coordinator met him at the landing pad. Her name was Veska Trell Drethani, early 50s, with the dark amber skin and heavy brow ridges of her species, dressed in field overalls stained with engine grease and something that might have been blood. She had a bolt rifle slung across her back, and the exhausted expression of someone who hadn't slept properly in 9 days. "You're the tracker," she said. "I'm a tracker." "You're human." "That's been established." She looked him over, late 30s, lean, with a weathered face and hands that had seen their share of fencing wire and field surgery. His hair was cropped close. His boots were scarred but solid. He looked like someone who'd been sleeping outdoors more often than indoors for the better part of a decade, and that assessment wasn't wrong. "The garrison sent a patrol 2 days ago," Veska said, leading him across the muddy pad toward the settlement's main cluster. 3 soldiers. They walked the perimeter fence, checked the motion sensors, filed a report that said, and I quote, "No actionable threat detected." That night, 2 more broadbacks died. "Where?" "Pen 4, Eastern Compound. Come, I'll show you." Pen 4 was a mess. The composite fencing rated for impacts up to 300 kilos had been breached from below, not smashed, not climbed, excavated. Something had dug under the foundation slab, pushed through 18 centimeters of compressed fill, and opened a hole wide enough to drag a 100-kilo carcass through. The edges of the hole were smooth, almost polished, as if whatever had dug it had done so with tools rather than claws. Nils crouched at the breach and ran his fingers along the rim. The soil was compacted in a pattern he didn't recognize, not the ragged gouging of claws, not the uniform bore of burrowing fauna. This was deliberate, systematic. The animal had removed material in layers, packing each layer against the walls of the tunnel to prevent collapse. "Ridgerunners don't dig," he said. "I know." He pulled out his scanner and swept the tunnel entrance. Biological residue, skin cells, follicle traces, saliva compounds registered in a cascade of data. He read the spectrograph slowly, cross-referencing against the planetary fauna database. No match. He ran it again. Same result. Whatever had dug this tunnel wasn't in the Drethani survey files. It wasn't in the expanded xenofauna registry. It wasn't, as far as the scanner could determine, a known species on any world in the Expansion Authority's catalog. Veska watched his face. "That expression," she said, "I've seen it before, on the garrison commander when he realized his report was wrong." "Your garrison commander wasn't wrong about what he saw. He was wrong about what he was looking for." "And what should he have been looking for?" Nils stood and looked at the terrain beyond the fence, rolling grassland darkening under a sky the color of tarnished copper, the tree line of a dense boreal forest 300 meters east. The forest was old growth, thick canopy, the kind of terrain where a large predator could move unseen from 100 meters and never break a branch. "Something that doesn't exist yet," he said. "I need to see where the forest starts, and I need to see it before dark." The tree line told him 3 things in the first 10 minutes. First, something large had been using the same approach route for days. The ground was soft enough to hold impressions, and the impressions were deep, 4-toed, wide-padded, with a stride length that put the animal between 200 and 300 kilos. The tracks followed a direct line from the deep forest to the colony fence, always through the same gap in the undergrowth, always returning the same way. Second, the animal was bipedal some of the time. Several tracks showed only 2 prints in sequence, rear feet, heavy, planted with deliberate balance before transitioning back to a 4-footed gait. That meant it could stand upright. That meant it could see over the fence. Third, it had been watching them. 40 meters into the tree line, Nils found the observation post. A patch of ground beneath a massive boreal trunk where the leaf litter had been compressed into a smooth depression, the size of a human sleeping bag. Long coarse hairs caught in the bark, iron gray, dense, with a metallic sheen that his scanner identified as keratin threaded with ferrous microfilaments. The animal's fur was laced with iron, naturally armored, built to absorb impacts and thermal variance. He sat in the depression and looked toward the settlement. From here, through a gap in the canopy, the eastern compound was perfectly visible. Pen 4, Pen 6, the main barn, the equipment shed where Veska kept the bolt rifle, the landing pad where his shuttle sat. The animal had been lying here, watching the colony, studying its routines. Not opportunistic, not reactive. Observational. "You've been doing your homework," Nils murmured to no one. He found scat 50 meters deeper, broadback tissue, cleanly digested, no bone fragments. The animal was consuming entire carcasses. The scanner flagged trace compounds, mineral fragments, silicate microcrystals, ferrous particulates. The animal was eating stone, supplementing its diet with the same iron-rich substrate that threaded its fur. He kept walking. The forest grew older the deeper he went, the trunks wider, the gaps between them wider too, ancient trees that had been growing since before the colony existed. The terrain rose gradually, following a geological ridge that ran northeast for 80 kilometers, a natural highway, the kind of corridor a territorial predator would patrol. And then he found something that stopped him cold. At the base of a rock outcrop, sheltered from the wind, someone had arranged a line of stones. 6 of them, each the size of a fist, laid in a curve that followed the natural contour of the outcrop. They hadn't fallen there. They hadn't been washed into position by rain. They were placed, deliberately, precisely, with spaces between them that were uniform to within a centimeter. It was abstract, it was intentional, and it made the hair on his neck stand up in a way that 20 years of predator fieldwork had never managed. He photographed them, marked the coordinates, and walked back to the settlement without saying a word. That night he didn't set a trap, he set a chair. He carried a folding camp stool to the eastern fence line, positioned it 3 meters from the breach in Pen 4, which he'd asked the colonists not to repair, and sat down. He had no weapon. He had his scanner, a thermos of coffee, and a portable infrared lamp that he angled at the ground in front of him, so it would illuminate anything approaching without blinding it. Vesca watched him from the equipment shed with the bolt rifle across her knees, and an expression that suggested she was seriously reconsidering the judgment of Terran wildlife specialists. "If it kills you," she said over the comm, "I'm not explaining to anyone how I let a human sit in the dark with no weapon waiting for the thing that's been eating my livestock. If it kills me, you won't need to explain. You'll need a bigger rifle. That's not comforting. It's not meant to be." He sat. The night came down thick. Tathran III had no moon, and the boreal canopy swallowed the starlight. The infrared lamp cast a dim red pool around the stool. Beyond it, darkness. An hour passed. 2. The settlement went quiet, lights dimming, the hum of the atmospheric processors settling into their nighttime cycle. The broadbacks in the remaining pens shifted and lowered occasionally, pressing against each other for warmth. At the 3rd hour his scanner chirped. Thermal contact. Large. Moving through the tree line at a walking pace following the established route. 240 kilos. Core temperature elevated, metabolic signature consistent with a large endothermic carnivore in active hunting mode. It was coming. He didn't move, didn't reach for the comm. He sat with his hands on his knees and his breathing steady and waited. The sound came first, a soft, rhythmic compression of leaf litter, 4-footed, deliberate, not stalking, not rushing, walking. The sound of an animal that had made this trip many times and saw no reason to hurry. Then the smell, dense, mineral-rich like wet stone and ozone, with an undertone of something organic and deeply unfamiliar. The iron-threaded fur. He could smell the metal in it. Then the shape. It emerged from the darkness at the edge of the infrared pool and stopped. Nils had seen a lot of predators in his career. He tracked Ureth IV's duskhorns through volcanic canyons. He'd tagged Vosk reef stalkers in chest-deep water. He'd spent 3 weeks in the canopy of Vureth IV watching stoneweavers build mineral fortifications. He thought he'd developed a reasonable tolerance for the sight of things that could kill him. This was different. The animal was enormous. Standing on all fours, its shoulder height matched his own seated eye level, 1.5 meters of dense, iron-gray mass. Its body was built like something between a bear and a great cat, heavy through the chest and shoulders, with thick forelegs ending in 4-toed paws equipped with retractable claws the length of his index finger. Its fur was dense, metallic, catching the infrared light with a dull sheen that made it look like the animal was wearing chainmail. Its head was broad, with a heavy jaw, deep-set eyes the color of molten copper, and a series of pit-like organs along its muzzle that Nils immediately recognized as thermal sensors. It could see heat. In the dark, it could see him as clearly as he could see it in daylight. It was also standing. The rear legs had adjusted, the spine had straightened, and the animal was watching him from its full bipedal height, well over 2 meters, the forelegs hanging loose at its sides, the copper eyes fixed on him with an intensity that had nothing to do with hunger. It was reading him, evaluating him, deciding. "Hello," Nils said quietly. The animal's ears, small, rounded, set high on the skull, rotated forward. The thermal pits along its muzzle flared. It took a single step closer, still bipedal, and the ground compressed under its weight. Nils poured coffee from his thermos into the cup. The sound metal on metal, the hiss of steam, made the animal's head tilt. Not a flinch, curiosity. He took a sip and set the cup on his knee. "You've been busy," he said, keeping his voice low and even. 14 broadbacks in 9 days. That's ambitious, even for something your size. The animal didn't move. Its breathing was audible now, slow, deep, controlled. Not the panting of something that had just crossed 300 meters at a trot. The breathing of something that was choosing to be still. Over the comm, he heard Veska's sharp intake of breath and the click of the bolt rifle's safety disengaging. He tapped his earpiece once, the prearranged signal for hold position. The click came back. Safety re-engaged. "The stones," Nils said. "At the outcrop. You placed those. You dug under the foundation slab. You packed the tunnel walls so they wouldn't collapse. You used the same route every night because you knew the motion sensors were calibrated for the fence line. You avoided the acoustic deterrents because you're not hunting by sound, you're hunting by heat." He took another sip of coffee. "You're not a pest, you're a strategist." The animal lowered itself back to 4 feet. The movement was fluid, not a collapse, not a crouch, but a deliberate shift in posture. It settled onto its haunches 5 meters from his stool, the massive head level with his chest, and made a sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a snarl. It was a low, resonant vibration that Nils felt in his sternum before he heard it, a frequency below normal speech, deep enough to travel through the ground. An infrasonic vocalization, the kind of sound that could carry for kilometers through dense forest. His scanner recorded it automatically. The waveform was complex, layered, modulated, with internal structure that the analysis software flagged as potentially linguistic. Nils looked at the animal. The animal looked at Nils. "Well," he said, "that changes things." He didn't sleep that night. The animal stayed for 47 minutes, sitting, watching, occasionally producing low-frequency vocalizations in patterns that his scanner dutifully recorded and failed to interpret. During the 23rd minute, the massive head came close enough that he could have reached out and touched the iron-gray fur between its ears. The thermal pits along its muzzle were aimed directly at his chest, reading his heartbeat, his core temperature, the involuntary flush of blood that adrenaline drove to the surface. It was taking his vitals, checking whether he was afraid. He wasn't. His heartbeat was 62 beats per minute, resting rate. His body, which had 20 years of field experience encoded into its autonomic responses, had made a judgment before his conscious mind caught up. This animal was not here to hunt. It was here to assess. The driftjaw held the position for 6 seconds. Then it pulled back, settled onto its haunches again, and produced a new vocalization, a shorter pattern, 2 tonal phases instead of 3, with a falling cadence that the scanner noted but couldn't interpret. Later, when the xenolinguistic framework was in place, that particular vocalization would be mapped to the semantic category closest to what humans would call acceptable. A judgment, a verdict reached. Then it rose, turned, and walked back into the forest on all 4s without looking back. No broadbecks died. Nils sat in the chair until the first gray light bled into the sky. His thermos was empty. His scanner's memory was full. His hands were cold, and his mind was running calculations he hadn't expected to run. Not the kill probability assessments of a tracker evaluating a dangerous animal, but the cognitive threshold assessments of a man who had watched something sit across from him in the dark and decide, through a process that looked very much like deliberation, that he was worth studying rather than eating. At dawn, Nils walked into Veska's office with 12 hours of scanner data and a request that was going to sound insane. Word had traveled, as it always did in small colonies, where 11 families shared 1 atmospheric processor and 3 frequencies of gossip, that the Terran tracker had spent the night sitting in a chair next to the breach, and something had come. I need you to stop hunting it." Veska, who had been up all night watching from the equipment shed, set down her coffee with deliberate care. "Excuse me. The animal is intelligent, not instinct intelligent, not pack coordination intelligent, structurally intelligent. It uses tools. It plans multi-step approaches. It has a vocalization system with internal modulation that my scanner is flagging as potentially structured communication. It's not raiding your pens because it's hungry. It's doing it because your colony is sitting on top of something it considers its territory. And the broadbacks are the simplest available food source in a landscape you've already altered." Veska's brow ridges drew together. "My broadbacks are a food source. Your broadbacks are replaceable. This animal is not. There's nothing like it in the planetary survey. You've been on Tathran III for 60 years, and no one has ever documented this species. That means it's either extremely rare, extremely good at avoiding detection, or both. It's extremely good at eating my livestock." "Yes, because you built a buffet in its living room. The alluvial valley is prime predator territory, thermal vents, deep forest cover, water access, natural game corridors. Your colony sits in the middle of the best hunting ground on the continent. So your professional recommendation is what? Let it keep eating." "My professional recommendation is to let me figure out what it wants." Veska stared at him for a long time. Behind her, 3 Drethani ranchers were repairing a fence, while a 4th stood guard with a charged bolt rifle. "You have 3 days," she said. "After that, I'm calling the garrison back, and this time I'm telling them to bring something heavier than a report." Day 2, Nils went into the forest. Not with weapons, not with traps, with a speaker. He'd spent the morning isolating the 3 most frequently repeated infrasonic patterns from the night's recordings. He found the observation post. The depression was warm, recently used, set the speaker on the ground and pressed play. The infrasonic waves rolled through the forest floor. He felt them in his knees before his ears registered anything. 11 minutes, then a response. The same 3 patterns from somewhere deep in the tree line. Same frequency, same modulation. But the 3rd pattern was extended, carrying additional internal structure his recorder captured in a cascade of data. It was answering him, and it was saying more. He played the response back. The reply came faster, 7 minutes. A new pattern entirely. 4 distinct tonal phases, layered with harmonic overtones carrying embedded directional information. The sound was telling him which way to go. Nils picked up the speaker and followed. The forest deepened. He walked for 40 minutes, following the directional cues in each new vocalization. The animal was guiding him along a route that avoided the steep ravines and dense thickets flanking his path, choosing the easy ground for him, the terrain a biped could manage. At one point the path forked around a massive fallen trunk, and Nils hesitated. A quick double pulse, directional, unmistakably indicating the left fork. He took it. The ground was firmer. The right fork dropped into a ravine seamed with loose shale. The animal had steered him away from a broken ankle. The valley opened without warning. One step he was in dense forest. The next, the trees fell away and he was standing at the edge of a natural amphitheater. A bowl-shaped depression 200 meters across, carved by ancient water action, its floor carpeted with thick, rust-colored moss warmed by thermal vents. And on that floor, the animal was waiting for him. It sat on its haunches at the center, its iron-gray bulk catching the dim light. Arranged around it in a rough semicircle were objects. Stones, dozens of them laid out in patterns he recognized from the outcrop. Curves, lines, clusters. Several incorporated stripped bark, polished broadback bone, metallic fur woven into tight spirals. It was a display. A communication built over days or weeks, laid out with the precision of someone who had something to say and no other way to say it. Nils walked down the slope. At 10 meters, the animal produced a single vocalization and extended a forepaw toward the nearest stone arrangement. A gesture, an invitation. Look. He looked. The stones were arranged in a map. It took him 20 minutes to see it. The scale was wrong for his instincts. The orientation rotated 90 degrees. But once it clicked, it was unmistakable. The largest cluster represented the colony, compound, pens, landing pad. Bark strips marked the tree line. Fur spirals marked thermal vents. The amphitheater was the largest stone, flat, iron-rich, the color of dried blood. Individual pens were distinguished by stone size. The atmospheric processor was marked with 3 small stones in a triangle, matching the processor's 3 exhaust vents. The animal had mapped the colony's infrastructure through observation and thermal sensing, with a fidelity requiring weeks of sustained attention. "This is your home," Nils said. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "All of this, the valley, the forest, the thermal corridors, you were here first." The animal drew 4 deep gouges in the moss near the colony cluster, the broadback pens, the kills. Then it shifted to the far side of the map, where a line of stones ran along the valley's northern escarpment, a migration route. It drew a single line from the colony cluster to the ridge line. "Move. You want us to move the herds, not leave. Move the grazing pens to the northern ridge, away from the thermal corridors." A single vocalization, the first pattern, sustained for 2 full seconds. The deep, territorial assertion that was an aggression, a declaration. "This is mine. I will share it if you move." "Okay," Nils said, "I hear you." He found Veska in the main compound, reviewing livestock insurance claims. "You want me to relocate 16 grazing pens to the northern ridge," she said, reading his proposal. "Because a predator drew you a map. Because a sapient animal showed me that the colony's grazing footprint overlaps with the primary thermal corridor that sustains the valley's native food web. When the natural prey was displaced by your fencing, the animal adapted. Your broadbacks were the replacement. Problem solving that cost me 14 head of broadback." "Yes, and if you send the garrison after it, you'll lose something more valuable. The vocalization data alone will rewrite 3 chapters of the xenolinguistics baseline. The tool use puts it in the same cognitive category as per-contact Tessavari. You're not dealing with a pest, Veska. You're dealing with a neighbor. If I move the pens and it keeps killing anyway, then I was wrong. But every single thing this animal has done says territorial negotiation, not compulsive predation. It showed me its territory map. It showed me where the conflict is. It drew a line to the solution. Predators that want to kill don't draw maps. They kill. The northern ridge has shallower soil. Soil remediation is what I was loading onto a shuttle when your call came in." Something shifted in her expression. The first crack in the exhaustion she'd been carrying for 9 days. "You were loading soil kits when you decided to come hunt my monster." "I was loading soil kits when I decided your monster deserved a conversation." "Start tomorrow." It took 4 days to move the pens. The Drethani ranchers did the heavy work, dismantling composite panels, hauling them by loader to the northern ridge, reassembling along the escarpment. Nils seeded the new grazing area with nutrient compounds that would bring the pasture up to viable density within a growing cycle. The colonists didn't trust him. He felt it in the way conversation stopped when he walked past, in the bolt rifle that was never more than arm's reach from whoever was on watch. 14 dead broadbacks bought a lot of skepticism. On the second day, a rancher named Goss Drethani, built like a loading crane, with hands the size of dinner plates, cornered Nils at the water station. "My daughter's broadback was in that pen," Goss said. His voice was flat, controlled, the kind of quiet that carried more weight than shouting. "The one her mother gave her before she died, marked calf, personal stock. That thing ate it on the third night while the girl slept 40 meters away. Nils looked at him. I'm sorry. Sorry doesn't breed replacement stock. Sorry doesn't explain to a 12-year-old why the galaxy thinks the thing that ate her inheritance deserves protection. I'm not asking you to protect it. I'm asking you to let me move the conflict zone before someone gets hurt, your people or the animal. What happens when the pens are moved and it decides the ridge isn't far enough? Predators that establish negotiated boundaries tend to enforce them, not because they're generous, because stability is cheaper than conflict. Every hunt costs energy. If the animal can maintain its food supply without engaging your colony, it will, not out of kindness, out of efficiency. Goss stared at him for a long time, his jaw working, the muscles in his neck corded with the effort of not saying the 3 or 4 things that were clearly fighting to get out. Then he picked up his water container and walked away without another word. That evening, Nils found a bolt rifle propped against the door of his temporary quarters, with a note in Drethani script that the translator rendered as, "In case your conversation doesn't go well." He left the rifle where it was. On the second night, the garrison made contact. A patrol shuttle overflew the settlement at dusk, searchlights raking the tree line. Veska took the comm call with Nils behind her. The garrison commander's voice was clipped. "Coordinator Trell, we've received a report you've retained an unaffiliated Terran wildlife specialist and suspended your predator abatement request. The garrison standing authorization is still active. The situation is under management, Commander. The livestock losses have stopped." The losses stopped because the animal hasn't been hungry for 2 days. Predators eat on cycles. Nils leaned toward the comm. "Commander, your patrol walked the perimeter 2 days before I arrived and filed a report saying there was no actionable threat. That night, 2 more broadbacks died inside a locked pen. With respect, your assessment methodology has already been tested." "Silence, then. We'll be in range if you change your mind." The afternoon of the second day, the garrison arrived anyway. 2 armored shuttles, 8 soldiers in tactical gear, led by a field lieutenant named Dren, whose expression carried the particular hardness of someone who had been told his competence was insufficient and had taken it personally. "Coordinator Trell, we've received authorization to deploy a Class 5 containment protocol. The predator will be neutralized." Veska stepped between them. She was shorter than either of them and outweighed by Dren's tactical armor by a factor of 2, but something in her posture, the squared shoulders, the set of her brow ridges, stopped Dren mid-stride. "Lieutenant, this is my settlement, my livestock, my decision. The expansion authority's abatement protocols supersede. The protocols are built on a Class 4 fauna survey. Mr. Cade's data suggests that survey is wrong. If you kill this animal and it turns out to be sapient adjacent, your career ends in a tribunal. Mine ends in a review board. But the animal ends in a body bag, and that's the one outcome nobody can undo." "I'll give you 10 days, he said. "I'm leaving a comm relay and 2 drone units. If there's another kill, 1 kill, I'm coming back with enough firepower to flatten every tree between here and the ridge." "There won't be another kill," Nils said. "You sound very confident for someone who's known this animal for 3 days." "I've known animals for 20 years. This one is smarter than your drones." Dren's jaw worked. He held Nils's gaze for a long 5 seconds, then turned on his heel and led his squad back to the shuttles. The 2 armored craft lifted off in a wash of dust and engine heat, and the colony watched them go with the complicated relief of people who had just avoided a fight they hadn't been sure they could win. Veska let out a long breath. 10 days. We'll be done in 4. On the third day, the fence crew hit a problem. The ridge substrate was too hard for anchor drills. Nils spent 4 hours with the Tessavari engineer, Shao, thin, angular, iridescent skin, The quiet competence of someone who'd been solving other people's problems on a fringe world for 15 years, redesigning the anchor configuration to use lateral bracing instead of vertical depth. This substrate, Shal said, iron-rich, the same ferrous compound in the creature's fur. The microfilament structure in the hair samples, the iron has to come from somewhere. This ridge substrate would be a natural source, which means the creature has been visiting this ridge regularly. Will the fencing interfere? Not if we leave a gap on the eastern slope, 20 meters, too steep for grazer hooves, but something with retractable claws and 240 kilos of muscle would manage fine. A fence that keeps livestock in and gives the predator its mineral access. Shal's iridescent skin rippled. I believe that is what your species would call a compromise. The new design was uglier than the original. It would hold, and it had a gap that no broadback would use and that a certain iron-furred predator would find exactly as passable as it needed to be. By the fourth evening, the last panel locked into place and the broadbacks were driven up the ridge in a lowing, reluctant column. They didn't want to go. Broadbacks were creatures of habit, and the old pens had been home for 3 years. It took the ranchers 2 hours to coax the herd through the new gate, and when the last animal was inside, Goss closed the gate with a force that bent the latch mechanism. Nils straightened it without comment. The animal didn't appear during the relocation, but on the third night, a passive thermal monitor showed a heat signature at the observation post, present for 6 hours, watching the work under floodlights. Not hunting, observing the change. On the 5th day, Nils went back to the amphitheater. The stone map had been modified. The colony's broadback pens, original position marked with a flat stone laid face down, gone, emptied, absent. A new cluster at the ridge line where the relocated pens now stood. The animal had been watching. It had updated its map. And at the center between the two clusters, a new arrangement. 2 stones, side by side. One iron gray, the same metallic rock the animal used to mark its own territory. One pale, the chalky white of the limestone the colonists used for foundation fill. 2 stones, side by side, not overlapping, not separated, adjacent. Nils sat on the amphitheater floor and looked at the arrangement for a long time. His chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the altitude. You understand coexistence, he said to the empty amphitheater. You've been trying to tell them from the start. A vocalization rolled through the ground beneath him, distant, deep, resonant. The territorial declaration, but with a rising inflection the scanner labeled as acknowledgement. Not this is mine, this is ours. The first week passed without a kill, then the second. On the 9th day, Goss showed up at Nils's quarters at dawn. My daughter went to the tree line yesterday. She wanted to see if the animal was real or just a story adults tell each other. She sat at the forest edge for an hour. Nothing happened. She was about to leave when she heard something in the ground, a vibration she felt through her boots. She looked up and there were 2 stones at her feet that hadn't been there when she sat down. Nils was very still. What kind of stones? 1 gray, 1 white. The coexistence symbol, placed at the feet of the rancher's daughter whose broadback it had eaten. She brought them home, Goss said. They're on her shelf next to her mother's photograph. He paused. I don't forgive the thing, Cade. 14 head is 14 head, but I'm not calling the garrison either. He turned and walked away. At the end of the corridor, the bolt rifle is still by your door. You can return it to the shed. On the 11th day, the thermal cycle storms arrived. 3 days of driving rain and wind that tested every panel in the new fencing. The lateral bracing held, Shal's redesigned flexing where rigid anchors would have snapped. The driftjaw used the gap Shal had built into the fence for mineral access, took what it needed from the substrate, and left. No broadback tracks within 50 meters. After the storm, Nils found the map updated again. flooding recorded with small flat stones matching actual water flow. And something new, 3 groups of paired stones, gray and white, gray and white, gray and white, arranged in a line pointing from the colony toward the deep forest. 3 coexistent symbols, in sequence, pointing into the future. The driftjaw was thinking in terms of generations. On the 18th day, a broadback calf wandered through a gap in the old pen site and ended up in the thermal corridor. Nils found it at the forest's edge, alive, unhurt, legs locked in terror. Behind it, between the calf and the deep forest, the predator sat on its haunches. 300 meters away, the search party stopped. Nils heard bolt rifles being charged. "Don't," he said into the calm. "It's between us and the calf. It's between the calf and the forest. Look at its position, facing inward toward the trees, not the colony. Its weight is on its front legs, not its back legs, bracing, not coiling. Ears oriented toward the forest. It's guarding the boundary." He walked forward alone. The grass was wet with dew, and the thermal corridor breathed warmth upward through the soil, creating a thin ground mist that swirled around his boots. At 30 meters, the driftjaw produced the acknowledgement pattern. "I know you." He walked past it at 8 meters. The animal's head turned to follow, the patient attention of a border guard, observing authorized passage. He reached the calf, took hold of its halter strap, and turned it around. The calf resisted for a moment. Its legs were stiff from standing in one position for so long, and the smell of the predator was still thick in the air. Then it followed him back toward the colony with the stumbling, relieved gait of something that had been terrified for hours and was now being led somewhere familiar. Behind them, the predator rose, turned, and walked into the forest without breaking a single branch. The search party stood in the grass and watched it go. Nobody moved for 30 seconds. Then Goss, who had been at the front of the group, his bolt rifle raised, finger resting on the guard, lowered the weapon and said something in Drethani that the translator didn't catch, but the tone made perfectly clear. It was the sound of a man reconsidering everything he'd been certain about. The broadback calf pressed against Nils's leg and refused to walk the last 50 meters without him. On the comm, Veska's voice came very quiet. "Did that animal just herd a lost broadback back to us?" "No, it stopped a broadback from entering its territory and held it at the boundary until someone came to collect it. Herding implies service. This was enforcement. It's maintaining the border from both sides. I'm putting the bolt rifle in the shed." On the 20th day, Dren's deadline expired. Veska took the call with Nils and Shao present. "Your 10 days are up, Coordinator. Your abatement order is based on a Class 4 fauna survey that my tracker's data has formally challenged. I've submitted a reclassification request to the regional assessor. 57 pages. Vocalization spectrographs. Cognitive metrics above the sapient adjacency threshold on 3 of 12 pale Tessivari markers. If you send a team and shoot something the authority later classifies as sapient adjacent, the tribunal won't be for me." Dren disconnected. The garrison's drones were recalled that afternoon. "That was a bluff," Nils said. "The provisional review status. That's not a real regulatory category." "It is now," she said. "I put it in the filing." For the first time since he'd arrived, he laughed. The weeks turned into a month. The broadbacks adapted to the northern ridge, slower weight gain, but the soil remediation was catching up. The atmospheric processors ran cleaner without the thermal corridor interference. The colonists had started calling the animal the driftjaw after its habit of appearing and vanishing along the thermal corridors like smoke. It became a known quantity, not domesticated, not tame, present, occasionally seen at dusk, standing bipedal at the tree line, watching the settlement with the copper eyes steady and the iron-gray fur catching the last light. The ranchers stopped flinching. The children started leaving offerings at the tree line, broadback jerky, bright stones, a knitted scarf. Once, Nils found polished pebbles arranged in a half-circle at the exact spot. Iron-gray driftjaw territory stone, each one small enough for a child's hand. Nils documented everything. Over 60 vocalization sequences, stone arrangements that evolved to track colony events, a supply shuttle marked within hours by new stones near the landing pad position, a heavy rainstorm's drainage path mapped with flat stones accurate to actual water flow. Shal began leaving technical scraps at the tree line. One morning, she found a defunct sensor crystal mounted at the exact point on the amphitheater map where the atmospheric processor stood. The driftjaw had recognized the crystal's function and placed it accordingly. It understood what the crystal was, she said, not just a shiny object, the function, the location, the relationship between the crystal and the processor. How? Observation, association, memory. The tools are different, the cognition isn't. He compiled a 57-page report recommending reclassification from Class 4 to Class 8, sapient adjacent. On the 34th day, the Expansion Authority's regional assessor arrived. Counselor Meaderth, senior Drethani bureaucrat with formal robes, a data slate the size of a cutting board, and the expression of someone assigned to investigate a nuisance complaint and deeply annoyed to discover it, was something more complicated. You are asking me to reclassify a 60-year-old planetary survey on the basis of a stack of rocks. On the basis of a sapient non-humanoid terrestrial species demonstrating tool use, structured communication, territorial negotiation, and cooperative boundary maintenance. Structured communication requires documented recursive grammar. Territorial negotiation requires a negotiating partner. What you've described is a predator that stopped eating livestock after you removed the livestock. That's behavioral adaptation, not sapience. Counselor, come to the forest with me. 2 hours. If what you see doesn't meet your criteria, I'll withdraw the report. She went, because desk reviews had a tendency to embarrass people when the field data turned out to be accurate. The stone map had been updated again. A new stone at the landing pad position, marking the assessor's arrival, placed within 12 hours. Count the stones in the colony cluster, Nils said, then count the residents. She counted. Her data slate counted with her. 43 stones for 43 souls, plus one new one placed that morning for the counselor herself. The animal had counted her. The color drained from the counselor's amber skin. He played the vocalization sequence. The response came in 9 minutes, an extended sequence the scanner flagged. Structured recursive modulation, grammatical probability 0.73. That's above threshold, she said quietly. The threshold requires 0.65. It's been above threshold since day 12. The extended vocalization this morning hit 0.81. I need to make a call. 40 minutes later, they're sending a research team, and they want to know why the original survey team didn't find the species. Because the original survey team was looking for threats, Nils said, not neighbors. The reclassification took 3 months. The Expansion Authority sent a research team, 5 xenobiologists with field equipment, and the carefully neutral expressions of scientists who had been told to expect a novelty and were professionally committed to being unimpressed. The lead researcher, a Drethani named Esoth with gray-streaked brow ridges and 30 years of field publications, spent the first 20 minutes in the amphitheater examining the stone map in clinical silence. She photographed every arrangement. She measured the spacing between stones with a calibrated laser. She documented the material composition of each element, the iron-gray territorial markers, the chalk-white colony stones, the woven fur spirals, the polished bone fragments. Then she played back a vocalization recording, and the driftjaw answered from the tree line. She played it again, modifying one tonal phase experimentally. The driftjaw's response changed to match. the same modification reflected back with an additional element appended. Esoth lowered the speaker and looked at Nils with an expression he recognized. The expression of a scientist whose career had just divided into before this moment and after. "It's correcting me," she said. "It's been correcting me for weeks. It has opinions about pronunciation." Over the following days, the research team's clinical neutrality eroded in stages. A junior researcher named Corin set up a sensor grid at the amphitheater's perimeter and spent 3 nights monitoring it remotely. On the second night, his grid recorded the driftjaw entering the amphitheater, walking directly to the stone map, and spending 47 minutes making modifications. A new stone cluster had appeared at the position of the research team's field camp, and the individual stones matched the number of researchers, 5, plus 1 additional stone set slightly apart. The additional stone was iron gray. Corin brought the data to Esoth at breakfast. "It counted us," he said. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. "And it placed a stone for itself. At the amphitheater, where we interact, it's marking the meeting place as shared space." "That's a different thing entirely," Esoth said quietly. "That's cartographic abstraction. The ability to represent a concept of place rather than a physical location, one of the 12 markers on the Pale Tessivari sapient scale. The driftjaw had crossed another threshold without knowing or caring that thresholds existed." The xenocognition specialist arrived 9 days later, a Tessivari named Pale who had published the standard reference text on non-humanoid sapience metrics. During her second week, the driftjaw walked into the amphitheater while the full team was present. It looked at the 5 researchers, then at Nils, and produced the acknowledgement sequence directed at him, not at them. It knew these newcomers, but it trusted the one who had come first. Pale's hands trembled as she adjusted her sensor array. The driftjaw watched her trembling hands. Then it produced a shorter, softer vocalization, a reduced threat signal, attempting to calm her down. Then it did something that became the centerpiece of Pale's published findings. Without prompting, it touched the colony cluster on its map, then the amphitheater marker, drew a line between them and produced the acknowledgement. Then it touched the research camp cluster, drew a line to the amphitheater, and produced a variant with a rising element the scanner flagged as interrogative. It was asking whether the researchers were part of the arrangement. Nils looked at Pale. Her iridescent skin had shifted to a deep, luminous violet, the Tessivari equivalent of awe. She nodded. "Yes," Nils said, "they're part of it." The driftjaw produced the territorial assertion, then the acknowledgement sequence. It had extended the agreement through a structured communicative act that included spatial reference, social categorization, and a conditional invitation. It had asked permission, and it had waited for an answer. Pale left with 400 hours of vocalization data and a grammar framework identifying 19 semantic units, including markers for spatial reference, temporal sequence, possession, negation, and the finding that made the interstellar journals a conditional tense. The animal could discuss hypotheticals. "If you move, I will not hunt. If the calf enters my corridor, I will hold it. If." Tathrin III was reclassified. The alluvial valley became a protected interaction zone. Corvesi received a conservation stipend that more than compensated for the reduced grazing yield. 3 more driftjaw individuals were documented, a female and 2 subadults, suggesting a small but viable population that had been avoiding the colony for decades. The female produced the coexistence vocalization toward the colony from 2 kilometers out, suggesting the agreement had been communicated within the species. Veska stood at the tree line one evening and watched the female driftjaw move through the thermal corridor with her 2 subadults flanking her. They stopped at the boundary marker, looked toward the settlement, and continued on their way. 60 years, Veska said. "We've been here 60 years and we never knew." "They knew about you. The survey team classified them as large fauna and moved on because no one asked the right questions. What's the right question? Not is it dangerous. The right question is, what is it trying to say? The two-stone symbol appeared in Pale's paper as a cover image. She titled it Acknowledged Sovereignty, not submission, not partnership, recognition. On the day Nils packed his field kit to leave, he walked to the tree line one last time. The evening was cool. Tathrin III's copper sky was deepening toward the true dark that came fast on a moonless world. The thermal corridors pulsed with warmth beneath the soil, and the boreal forest was alive with the sounds of an ecosystem operating without obstruction for the first time in 60 years. He set the speaker on the ground and played the acknowledgement sequence. 3 patterns, a sustained note. The response came in 4 minutes, closer than he expected. The driftjaw was at the tree line, standing bipedal, its full height silhouetted against the dark trunks, the copper eyes catching the last light. It was not alone. The female stood behind it, lower, copper eyes a shade darker, iron-gray fur sleek where the male's was heavy and scarred. The 2 subadults were further back, lighter juvenile pelts catching amber light between the trunks. A family, watching the human who had listened when no one else would. The male produced a vocalization Nils hadn't heard before, longer than any in the recorded library. Layered, complex. His scanner produced an analysis that made him sit down on the grass. The modulation pattern matched the acknowledgement, but in reverse. Where the acknowledgement said, "I know you," this said something structurally inverted. The conditional tense markers were there, spatial reference units pointing outward, toward the landing pad. It was a farewell, a structured, grammatically coherent farewell that incorporated the conditional tense. If you go, the arrangement holds. Yeah, Nils said. His voice wasn't steady. He didn't try to make it steady. It holds. The driftjaw watched him for another minute. Its copper eyes held what he'd seen on the first night, that flat, measuring attention of something deciding what he was. But the conclusion was different now. Not cautious neutrality. Something the xenolinguistic framework didn't have a category for, between trust and respect, and the particular gravity of 2 predators who had chosen to sit down instead of fight. One more sound, brief, low, terminal drop, completed interaction, a period at the end of a sentence. Then it lowered to 4 feet, turned, and walked into the forest. The female and the subadults followed, 4 iron-gray shapes dissolving into the tree line like smoke. His scanner tracked their thermal signatures for 8 minutes, moving together, moving home, moving through the corridors they had defended for years before anyone arrived to notice. Nils sat in the grass until the stars came out. The thermal vents pulsed warmth through the soil beneath him, and somewhere in the forest the driftjaw was walking the corridors it had fought for, not through violence, but through the patient, stubborn insistence that it deserved to be heard. He thought about the first night, the chair, the coffee, the darkness, the moment when a quarter-ton predator had stood up in front of him and he'd said hello instead of reaching for a weapon. He thought about the stones, the map, the 12-year-old girl with 2 rocks on her shelf, the rancher who'd left a bolt rifle at his door and then taken it back, the Tessavari engineer who had built a gap in a fence because she understood that a compromise isn't weakness. 20 years of field work, 6 worlds. Hundreds of animals whose trust he'd earned and whose languages he'd never had the tools to hear. He'd tagged duskhorns and watched them walk away into volcanic mist. He'd released reef stalkers into deep water and felt the current of their passage against his legs. He'd crouched in canopy hides for weeks while stoneweavers built walls around him, and never once acknowledged his presence with anything he could call communication. This was different. This was the first time one of them had said goodbye, and the first time the goodbye had carried a conditional clause, a promise that the peace would hold in his absence, built into the grammar of a language that hadn't existed in any database 4 months ago. He picked up the speaker, walked back to the settlement and finished packing. The shuttle left at dawn. Below, the colony shrank to a cluster of lights in a copper valley, and the boreal forest spread out in every direction, ancient and deep, and full of a language the galaxy was just beginning to learn to hear. Veska's voice came through the calm as he cleared atmosphere. "Cade." "Yeah." "Shall found something at the tree line this morning, near where you were sitting last night. 2 stones, one iron gray, one white, side by side, and a third stone behind them, smaller, set apart, pointing at the landing pad." Nils closed his eyes. 3 stones, the coexistence symbol, and a third, pointing in the direction he'd gone. The Driftgel had updated its territory record one last time. "Leave them where they are," he said. "I know," Veska said. There was a pause. Cade, the children went to the tree line at dawn. 9 of them. They sat in the grass and waited. After about 20 minutes, the young ones came out of the forest, the subadults. They sat at the boundary marker and looked at the children. Nobody moved for a long time. Then one of the subadults pushed a stone forward with its nose, gray, and one of the children, Goss's daughter, pushed a white stone forward. Nils didn't say anything for a while. Below him, the shuttle was climbing through the cloud layer, and the copper valley was disappearing under a white horizon that stretched in every direction. "The next generation," he said finally, "teaching each other. What does that make us, Cade?" He thought about the question. He thought about a colony that had lived on a world for 60 years and never known what lived beside them. He thought about a predator that had mapped every structure, counted every resident, and drawn a line in the moss that said move, not leave. He thought about the gap that Shal had built into the fence, and the bolt rifle that Goss had taken back, and the 2 stones on a shelf next to a dead woman's photograph. "Neighbors," he said. "It makes us neighbors." The comm clicked off. The shuttle broke atmosphere and the stars came in cold and clear, and behind him a valley held its breath between 2 species who had learned the hardest lesson the galaxy had to teach. That sovereignty isn't a wall. It's 2 stones, side by side, with space between them for both.